It's pretty tough to be riding the drags on a night like this. I know I was a bum once myself.
Although he was recognized in his lifetime, I think more has occurred, as it often occurs to radical artists, has occurred after his death. His main contributions have been in the area of revitalizing the materials of music and questioning the inherited canon and structural materials from Western music tradition by rethinking, going back to very ancient Greek roots, rethinking the fundamental scale systems, tuning systems. He was really the first major creative figure, although there were certain surviving elements of interest through the 19th century of people who were interested in tuning systems other than 12-tone equal temperament. He was really the first major composer of the 20th century to really, in a systematic way, create a body of work that was based on a very different set of assumptions.
Okay, I'm going to try and explain in a few words what Harry did with microtones. And it's a difficult explanation because most people that are watching this documentary may not know the musical terminology. So the analogy that I like to give that I think everyone understands is that we can go to an art supply or a stationery store and we can buy a box of crayons. And some of the boxes have 8 in them, some of them have 12, some of them have 72, and some of them have 144. If you buy the box of crayons that has 12 in it, then you are stuck with those 12 colors. And that is exactly what every tuning system in the world buys, a box of crayons that has a certain set number of possibilities in it. The Western scale that's in common use, which is called 12-tone equal temperament, is basically a box of 12 crayons. What Harry Partch wasn't satisfied with was that limitation. And so he basically created instruments that in a way bought the larger box of crayons so that he could have more subtle colors to use in his compositions. This is Harry Partch's Chromelodion. It's actually Chromelodion 1, and it's a second Chromelodion 1 because we've rebuilt his first one. It's a 43 tones per octave keyboard instrument.
An inscription given to me by a Japanese calligrapher has hung on my studio walls in recent years. And it says, "Though homeless, you make a shrine wherever you are." At the moment, my shrine happens to be in Chicago. And if it is a shrine, it becomes one only through the musical instrument.
It's very much of the tradition that you could think of, like as Levi-Strauss called the bricoleur, the person who takes various elements and integrates them and finds whatever they need out of the environment they're living in. And in Partch's case, he did that not only in how he built the instruments, making them out of things as common as liquor bottles or light bulbs or other kinds of objects that he could integrate as percussion sources. But he would always do that in a way in which they were fully integrated as musical instruments. They always took on another level rather than just arbitrarily making sounds that were interesting for just the sake of sound. He always integrated them into his tuning system and organized them in that way.
The instruments are an integral part of the development of the tuning system, because if Harry was a composer that came along maybe 30, 40 years later, when there's electronic means of doing this, I'll tell you, it would have been a lot easier to use electronics than to build instruments. Harry took the difficult way with this.
His close friend Francis Thumb, whom he had met in the late 60s while in San Diego, was a classically trained musician and a member of the Harry Partch Ensemble, and he would become a key collaborator during Waite's artistic reinvention.
Well, Harry moved to San Diego in the either late 60s, early 70s, and which is where I first met him, which was in probably 1970 is when we first met. So the ensemble that formed around those years were all musicians, largely musicians that were in San Diego, with a couple of exceptions, some people who were in Los Angeles. Francis was one of those. We were actually students together at San Diego State University at that time, and he had been one of Tom's closest friends throughout their adolescent years, and actually a lot of Tom's early music is sort of recounts of their adventures together. And so I know that's how Tom's awareness of the music came about, was through Francis.
When Tom is starting to work on Swordfish trombones, he's reconnecting with his old friend Francis Thumb, who's a music professor and associated with San Diego State University, and plays in the Harry Partch Ensemble, where Harry Partch granted all of his instruments, these beautiful architecturally structured but unusual instruments, to them. And this is an open space like Beefheart for Tom to pursue music as sound. You know, that sensibility is very appealing to Tom, and the freedom of Partch's example is extremely important to him. I can construct music out of anything in the room. It starts in Swordfish trombones. He drags a chair across the room in the recording studio, and it makes this huge screech, and he's like, let's keep that on the tape.
The city allows you 2 meals and bed for 1 night only.
It's a sort of twofold thing, really. It is what Partch represents, which is that, you know, he'd lived this strange kind of outsider life as a kind of hobo, as a homosexual, as someone who's certainly not kind of recognised. That really appealed to Waite. I mean, Waite was really questing for anything that took rock or American popular music outside of this sort of cliched setup of guitars and bass and drums and the 3 chords and everything that he was just so bored of, so bored of. The sorts of textures that he was hearing in Partch's compositions and the recordings, both before Partch's death and after his death, really, really intrigued him and interested him, and particularly the textures of these sort of giant marimbas that Partch built, but other strange sound signatures and textures that he was hearing in Partch's music. I mean, he wanted to sort of bring this into his music. He wanted to create some sort of ambient sound field that was very different from orthodox, rock music.
Perhaps one of the things that's been less remarked when Waite's music undergoes this quite revolutionary change. Everybody has talked about his discovery of dissonance, but what goes with the dissonance is in fact a far greater rhythmic impulse than has informed his music previously. And I think that probably does very much come from the Harry Partch influence. These 2 things are running parallel. On the one hand, he's got this influence from Harry Partch, which is very much a conceptual one. I remember him saying to me that he decided he wanted to know what a piano burning on the beach sounded like until the strings popped. And so that comes from Harry Partch. The marimba comes from Harry Partch. The idea of the junkyard orchestra, the invented homemade instruments, comes from Harry Partch. But with all that comes this great rhythmic impetus, which is not something you'd have necessarily associated with his albums from a previous period.
And there were other classical music pioneers who emerged in the first half of the 20th century that Waite was drawn to. Kurt Weill, the distinctive stage composer who made his name in the 1920s, would become a major influence on his work after Swordfish Trombones. Weill, born in 1900 in Dessau, Germany, was a gifted pianist as a child and would later study composition with two of Europe's most prodigious talents, Engelbert Humperdinck and Ferruccio Busoni. He would go on to tread his own unique and distinctive path in classical music.
After his apprenticeship with Busoni, Weill represented himself on the musical scenes with one-act operas, string quartets, the kind of thing that you would expect from a composer who was trained in the serious tradition. Bit by bit, though, he absorbed the popular culture that was prevalent in Weimar, Berlin, and in 1927 met the poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht and decided to set some of Brecht's poems to music and set them using the idiom of the American popular song, created a hybrid which is literally represented in the title of that piece, Songspiel. On the one hand, it's like a German Singspiel, which is the German word for opera composed in the German vernacular. On the other hand, it has injected into it these somewhat surreal American songs, some of them written in pidgin English.
If the success of the Mahogany Songspiel had indicated the potential of the Weill and Brecht partnership, their next production brought them to an even wider audience. Again, blending both classical and popular music, the pair set to work in 1928 on what would become their most celebrated achievement. Based on John Gay's 18th century English work, The Beggar's Opera, Weill and Brecht's 1928 production, The Threepenny Opera, combined a unique compositional style with a very modern Marxist approach to theatre. It was both revolutionary and a phenomenal success.
This is part of this new classicality. They took a classical piece and they updated it, they modernized it, they injected into the musical idiom what was called at the time jazz. It was really a form of dance music. They threw in some of the original music from the 18th century. This had been a smash hit in 1728, and in 1928 this revamped version of the Beggar's Opera, updated by Brecht in terms of the lyrics and the text, updated by Weill very much musically, became an absolute smash hit.
Und ein Mensch geht die Ecke, den man Messer nennt. Und Schulmeier.
This changed Kurt Weill's career forever. After this time, he became known as someone who was able very successfully to effect a crossover from serious music to a more popular idiom. He wasn't literally a popular composer. He still had classical aspirations. He had the aspiration to reform opera from within. But nonetheless, it seems at that point that his move towards a more popular musical language was irreversible.
Not only did Weill and Brecht incorporate popular musical forms into their production, the piece also had a strong political agenda. Focusing on poverty, criminality, and the hypocrisy of the class and justice systems, the Threepenny Opera dealt with the struggles of the marginalized in order to critique the capitalist system.
In many ways, I think his whole generation was reacting against the long 19th century. They saw themselves as making a new beginning, that in a way they were anti-romantics. They used romantic means very often, but their basic stance was one of almost cynicism about the modern world. They were very critical of the modern world. And in their criticism of the modern world, they also wanted to get their message across. Things are rather tawdry. There are prostitutes, there are pimps. Later, the Nazis would accuse him of embracing this whole milieu as if he were condoning it and supporting it. But I think in many ways, Kurt Weill was a moralist who was very critical of modern society.
Yet the Nazis' perception of Weill as a corrupting influence upon the national character and their persecution of him as a prominent Jewish composer led him to flee Germany in 1933. He finally settled in New York City 2 years later and over the next decade continued to work on compositions and productions that aimed to meld both popular and classical forms. He established himself in the American musical theatre, collaborating with esteemed writers Maxwell Anderson, Ira Gershwin, and Langston Hughes. Yet after his death in 1950, it was his early, more critically revered work that reached a new mainstream audience. Bondi University in Massachusetts staged a new English adaptation of the Threepenny Opera, starring Weil's widow, Lotte Lenya, and conducted by Leonard Bernstein. The show was a spectacular hit and included the translated song Mac the Knife, which would then become a standard in popular music.
This was the context in which people like Frank Sinatra and Bobby Darin, Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, etc., came out with their versions, as it were, riding on the coattails of this incredible smash hit on off-Broadway, but also generating further success for that production.
Just a jackknife has old Mac Heath, baby, and it keeps it out of sight. 2, 2, 3, 4. You know when that shark bites with his teeth, baby, scarlet billows start to spread.